Yeah, the WNBA is an interesting one for you because, as you've indicated in writing about it, there is such emotionality really revolving around Caitlin Clark, who ironically is not self-presenting as anybody controversial. And you're one of the people whose analysis I just trust is not being infected by that particular conversation. And when you come up with analysis that runs contra to my subjective take of what I'm watching, I go, oh, that's interesting. And I know there's no angle here when you're talking about the statistical models not being all that positive about Clark and not agreeing that she should be on the Olympic team. It's nice to be able to come to a place and go, okay, this is a place where I know that that is a perspective that it might be right or wrong, but it's not part of this other thing that seems to derange people and make them see things that aren't there or make them not see things that are there.
Yeah, and that was kind of the perspective. I wrote a thing about why the advanced metrics were maybe not as high on Caitlin Clark as we would expect. And she has actually gone up. I wrote a thing, I do freelance work for ESPN, and they wanted a rookie ranking of the WNBA rookie class because it's a very historically star-powered class. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And I expected and fully, I'm not going to say I wanted, but like I really was rooting for Caitlin Clark to be, very high on the list. And then deadline comes around for the first edition of this column. She is, I think, sixth, which is, a lot of people had a problem with that. And I think from a subjective standpoint, I totally understand that, especially given, like you mentioned, the emotions around it, just the eye test of watching her play. She's extremely exciting to watch. And so I did that, and it was just purely based on the metrics. And she has actually risen, although she is behind Angel Reese right now. I'm preparing the second version of it. And of course, both of them are, they're playing a lot better than they were a month ago. And they're both going in kind of different ways of doing it as well. Like Angel Reese has this historic double-double streak that she's putting up. She's kind of putting up numbers in the box score. Caitlin Clark, of course, is also putting up numbers. And I think there's a really interesting, like if you could put aside, and I got a lot of blowback from where I ranked Caitlin Clark the first time around, put aside the idea of there's a lot of things to unpack in there of like, okay, it was only like 3 weeks into the season. We said we would be updating it. There's a difference between backwards looking value and forward looking projection, all of that stuff. But also, one of the things I did in my subsequent piece where I was sort of looking at like, why don't these stats like Caitlin Clark as much as you would expect? There is a really demonstrable effect where guards, even really highly touted guards, so we're talking about Sabrina Ionescu, all of these generational guards that have come out in recent years, they take a while to show up as being really valuable players in the WNBA compared with bigs like an Aaliyah Boston, who had really good numbers last year. Her numbers have kind of puzzlingly, or maybe not so puzzlingly, fallen off a little bit playing with Caitlin Clark, because I think she's a unique player to even fit other players around, and they have to change to accommodate her style. But there is just this effect where the learning curve seems to be much higher if you're a perimeter player in the WNBA versus a big or someone who plays inside. And that's an insight that you actually couldn't get if you were wrapped up in some of the hype around things and you were just looking at it of like, she's shooting these logo threes. It's amazing. And I'm like, I agree, but there's other factors in there, whether it's, looking at the turnovers, looking at the on versus off effect on her team. And so there's many different facets that you can unpack. And I like that. I like the fact that you can say, well, she looks really good in this one thing, but less good in this other thing. But then there's this maybe factor that's not being accounted for in the stats. And that's, I think, really exciting about breaking things down with analytics.
Yeah, I'll give you one that you talked about that it's just interesting to think about. I know some of the people are listening right now and maybe they don't want to hear about WNBA because frankly, the players aren't as good as the NBA. They don't say that on ESPN, but everybody in real life understands that. I don't take that understanding and then go, oh, I hate this product. I like the Roger Ebert. It's not what a movie is, but how it is about it. Whatever I'm enjoying sports wise, I can find something in there to puzzle over and think about. And in this case, some of the differences in quality actually, I think, create some new questions. One of them regarding Clark is this: she's got this crazy high turnover rate. And when you watch her play, and as some of her defenders have noted in these highlights, a lot of the passes are dead-on passes that just hit players in the hands and peter on out of bounds. And some of these are these full-court passes. And so my instinct is to go, well, these turnovers aren't her fault. But then I think another level beyond that, and I go, well, wait a second, though. If these passes that I would expect to be caught are so regularly not caught, then at that point, are these poor plays to make? And in a way, they are her fault. And it suggests that she should be jacking more threes or scoring more because, look, maybe you would want these teammates to catch these passes and they would be expected to do so in the basketball I normally watch. But if they're not, then they're not. And I have no guarantee that they're going to start doing it. So then what does that mean, Neil?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it gets back to that thing that I sort of mentioned for a split second about this idea of backwards looking value versus sort of projecting talent going forward or sort of in a neutral environment of, the turnovers happened. They cost the team possessions. Like if you're accounting for things looking backwards, you can try to split those up between the person that made the pass versus not. She actually leads the WNBA in bad pass turnovers, which is a category that they actually track. You can go to Basketball Reference and look at that by like a wide margin over the second ranked player. So I think a little bit of that is like overstated perhaps of the players with the hands of the teammates with the hands of stone, letting them sort of like bounce off, which I've seen, a great number of times as well.
It's clearly both. She is a lot.
Oh yeah, it's both. Right. I mean, if you're passing as much as she is, and that's something that I want to talk about in a second as well. But there is this idea of like, okay, how much value was lost through the turnovers to the team to this point in the season versus, okay, if you have players that are becoming more accustomed to playing with her, and they're NBA players, like especially players that played with Magic Johnson. I think about, I forget about who exactly said this, but this idea of like, okay, when he has the ball, no matter where you are on the court, have your hands up, be ready. You have to be ready because your normal basketball IQ of like, okay, I'm in a place where I can't possibly receive a pass and nobody's going to even think to give me a pass. It just doesn't apply when you have a player of that ability. And you see that a little bit with like, Nikola Jokic is somebody like that as well, where I think it's just a recalibration, and that takes time when you've been playing with, for lack of a better term, like normal players for a long time. And then you have this player that is like just totally redefining, different aspects of the game. And so I think if you're projecting going forward, you would think those would be reduced and that you would get a truer sense of how much the turnovers and the assist to turnover ratio really reflects her ability as a passer. But then also one of the things I noted in my Substack piece about her was there's this concept, which I think it was Seth Partnow, who's with The Athletic, coined, which is heliocentrism, which I'm sure you've heard many times as an NBA beat reporter.
I am fascinated. I said this on a podcast with Jesse Single that this is caught on, and I credit Seth for making fetch happen. I am never able to make fetch happen, and I'm just, how did such a tricky erudite term catch to this degree, this heliocentricity? But yes, continue
Oh,
on.
You just have, so many fans of Nicholas Copernicus out there that it just really kind of latched on. Yeah.
I forgot about that.
But no, I made the case that Caitlin Clark is almost like, I don't know if she's the first heliocentric WNBA player, but she is like kind of the most heliocentric player in the league right now, in a way that like she has a really high usage rate, which is the share of like shooting possessions that you use when you're on the court. There's a lot of scorers in the WNBA, so she's not number one in that. But the combination of her assist rate as well with the usage rate, nobody else in the league has that combination of those two metrics. And that's like, a James Harden or, some of these guys in the NBA as they progressed into this era of like, let's just have one guy. He's going to run high pick and roll. He's going to isolate. He's going to cook, basically. You didn't really have that in the WNBA as much in the past. And so there is also this sense that like Caitlin Clark is playing a different style fundamentally than we've seen from like most players in the history of the WNBA, because the WNBA is a lot more of a big oriented sport, like an interior oriented sport. And that's why I think, you know, A'ja Wilson was kind of complaining. I know you've talked about this on the podcast, but a lot of the noise around like, well, why is Caitlin Clark getting a shoe deal and A'ja Wilson, you know, set the all-time WNBA single game scoring record and is this multi-time champion, leader of this like dynasty with the Aces. She's not getting the same level of attention. And I know there's like a lot going on in there to unpack. And, you know, that it would take the whole podcast to do that. But I think a little bit of that is that like A'ja Wilson plays just fundamentally more of sort of an interior game.
It's aesthetic.
It's aesthetic. Exactly.